Okay, this week we're going to try to cover some ground here and go through. We covered some ground last week, but try to get through the flood, Genesis 6 through 8 into chapter 9, kind of setting us up for chapter 10. One thing that I do just want to kind of bring up again is the class is Studies in Torah, Foundations for the Jewish Narrative. And so we're looking at like big picture pieces that are necessary for understanding the covenant with Abraham and the unfolding of the story of the Bible, which is the story of the God of Israel and his covenants with the nation of Israel. And so this is kind of the backstory, the universal backstory to, 98% of the Bible. And so, we have to kind of see the context from what happened in this backstory to help us understand the other things. So we're not hitting every piece in Genesis, obviously. You guys have probably picked up on that. But there's a lot of ground that we can't cover in Genesis. We're not trying to hit systematically through every piece, but I think there are some big picture pieces that we have to really cover, and so that's what we're going to try to do tonight, and what we've kind of tried to do with the past sessions a little bit. So, if you would turn to Genesis 6, and also we have notes, but we're going to kind of read through some different sections tonight. One thing I do want to kind of bring up is just to reiterate, we talked about creation, and we talked about this garden and this mountain in the garden and this temple structure of the garden, and Adam is set in the garden to cultivate and keep it. Those two words are used throughout the scriptures as priestly terms. So Adam was a priest in God's garden, and then the serpent's there, the enticement of men to be like the gods. They take from the tree, they eat, and God pronounces curse on the serpent, curse on the ground, and then he drives men out of the garden. It's kind of the picture of even what we'll see later in the scriptures of Israel in their exile. They're driven from holy space, sacred space in their story over and over again. And so we see that picture playing out. And then we didn't really cover very much in Genesis 4, but in Genesis 4 we have Eve longing for the seed that was promised in Genesis 3. She's longing for the offspring. She's given a child. Cain kills Abel. He's not remorseful even for his sin. The murder is present in the heart of man. And Cain says, "My punishment's too great to bear. You've driven me from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden." Again, God driving him out from this space, where he is there. And then we have the lineage goes forward into chapter 4 and I know you guys have read this, but she gives birth to another son and names him Seth, which means frailty. And it's like, this one could be the seed, this one could be the seed, and they're disqualified by death or by murder and violence. And then finally Seth comes along, and it's like, frailty, and men begin to invoke the name of the Lord. And at the end of Genesis 4, men begin to call upon the name of the Lord. And then we open up into chapter 5, where man is sitting on death row over and over again. And he died, and he died, and he died, right? And then we looked at chapter 6 with the, at the end of chapter 5, we didn't really hit this, but at the end of chapter 5, Lamech becomes the father of a son, and he names him Noah, which literally means rest. And so in Hebrew, it's a verb. So you can say like, I rested, or lanuach, like it's like I rest and to rest. And so this one, maybe he'll give us rest from the toil of the cursed earth, cursed ground. And this figure, it becomes in chapter 6, we'll talk more about Noah, but chapter 6 opens up with men trying to kind of usurp again. Divine beings are usurping their boundaries. Both of them are kind of meeting in the middle, and there's this divine transgression, human transgression happening in Genesis 6. And so that kind of sets the stage for the judgment of the flood. And I know this is a familiar event for all of us, but let's look at Genesis 6. We stopped last week in verse 4. So, verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I've created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So, if you look in the notes, there's a really interesting feature here in verse 5. It says, the wickedness of man was great, coming out of this, divine and human transgression of boundaries. We see that contributed to and really catalyzed the wickedness of what's going on in the earth during this time, and the violence we see later, the violence in the earth. But this word intent is in Hebrew it's yaser. It's only used 3 times in the Torah. It's used here. It's used in chapter 8, verse 21. We can look at that really quick. It says, this is after the flood. He says, I'll never again curse the ground on account of the man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And then this other, the third reference in the Torah is in Deuteronomy 31, when Israel's about to go into the land. Moses is giving them a song, a prophetic song that they will remember all their days. And he talks about, I know the intent that's in their heart, that they're going to go after other gods in the land. And so this actually becomes really part of the Jewish worldview concerning sin, is that there is a intention, an inclination towards evil. But also there can be inclination towards good. And so but the predominant one we see is that man has this intent and bent, inclined towards evil. Okay? And that's what we see at the end of Genesis 8, verse 21. But we see Yahweh's regret. And it says that he was grieved in his heart, which the word there means that he was saddened and bitterly indignant in his heart. Like, it's such an intense, emotive word that's going on here. This is like, it's the revulsion of the wickedness of what's going on, and it's this sadness and indignant towards what's happening. So, before we move into this next section, I want to point out that if you look on the right side of the top of the page, this funny looking arrow thing, this is something that for you guys to look into on your own, but the flood narrative in the scripture has a very beautiful and, I believe, an intended structure to it. And so, like when you guys read the Psalms, sometimes, have you guys heard of I only know how to say it from being in school overseas, but they say chiasm. Have you heard of chiasm before? It's a feature where there's a pattern, and it happens a lot in the Psalms, where it happens in poetry a lot, where it's a pattern like A, B, B, A. They'll say something, and then they'll say something else, and then they'll say the inner pieces are almost like similar, and then the outside pieces are similar. And so it kind of has this stair-step structure to it. And so in this is the most elaborate pattern. Normally it's just like that little feature, but this is over chapters. And so it's so beautiful, but the intention is the whole thing revolves around chapter 8, verse 1. God remembers Noah. And that is the revolving point around the entire narrative. And if you look at these features, if you compare the A, Noah, to the A at the bottom, Noah. And even things like numbering of days, where there's like stuff like if you look at I, there's 7 days waiting for the flood, 7 days waiting for the waters to subside. It's like these are patterned right after each other, different sections. So you guys can take this and look at it on your own, but it really makes this narrative come alive even more of what's going on with the flood narrative itself. So, but yeah, let's look at, so in verse 9 of Genesis 6, it opens up this new section in the book of Genesis called the generations or the histories of Noah. We just concluded the histories of man that started in chapter 5, and it opens up this new section of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God like Enoch before him, and he was a good man. Saying a righteous man is kind of like a Hebrew idiom of saying he was a good man. But he was also blameless, even beyond just being a good man, a just man. He was blameless before God in light of these things that are happening. Became the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, verse 11, the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So there's a lot of corruption going on here. If you look at the repetition of the words in 11 and 12, there's, and even into verse 13 here, it's used again. It says, God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Behold, I'm about to, here's the word, corrupt or destroy them with the earth. It's used, the Hebrew word is the same word translated as corrupt. And so one way to translate it could just be ruin, because it has the idea of something that is spoiling, but it's also used in context of sudden divine judgment. And so that kind of encapsulates the idea of ruin. Something is being ruined wickedly, and God is going to ruin them with judgment. And so, so here it says, we have the description of, in verse 17, after he tells Noah to make an ark, says, I'm bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that's on the earth shall perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you, your sons, and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind of the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, the birds, animals of their kind, creeping things, the ground after his kind, two of every kind will come, for you to keep them alive. It's just the emphasis again on this is your job. You're keeping them alive. You're preserving them unto life. As for you, take for yourself the food. And Noah did all that God commanded. So, in verse 18, this is the very first reference in the entire Bible to the word covenant. And this is really important. Genesis is filled with precedents, and so precedent helps us where we look at the first happening of something, and that helps us define all the later happenings, and there can be like developments through the Bible, but it's really important for us to look at the precedent, the first instances of words and ideas and where they come from. It's a friend of David and I, he says a lot of times, he's like, you come to a problem passage in the Bible, for all you English speakers, go left. Like that's really the answer, is to go left. Don't go right, go left, to understand what's going on with the interpretation of something. And so this word even here, he talks about, I will confirm or establish the covenant with Noah. Some commentators actually say that it seems like Noah is already kind of in covenant with God with the language of the words that are used here, but we don't really have the actual description of the covenant terms until later, until chapter 9. And so it could be that what's kind of built into this thing is God is preserving these people and sustaining them in life, and it's kind of built into the covenant itself. But so let's look at chapter 7. One of the big picture things, and we're not going to read all of this through the flood and all of the events that's happening here, but one of the big picture things, especially when you get to verses 5 through 16, and we're going to kind of do the sweeping overview of this, but there's really just two things that are going on here. It's the flood is coming, and you need to get in the ark. It just says it over and over again. It says, flood in verse 6, enter the ark, 7 through 9. It has it. They enter the ark, the water of the flood. The flood is coming, verses 10 through 12. Enter the ark, verses 13 through 16. The flood is coming, verse 17. It just, these little phrases over and over, and it's just almost like, here's just the two big things of what's going on in the narrative here. All right? So, I'll just read verse 10 and 11. Came about after the 7 days, the water of the flood came upon the earth. The 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. The floodgates of the sky were open. And the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And so what you have here is waters from below coming forth, and waters from above coming down. And so what God set forth in order of separating out the heavens and the earth and separating out the waters, He allows them to collide again and sends the collision of those waters on the earth again. And so it really is again, it's a picture of decreation almost, of the way that creation was separated out and set in order, and this is the decreation and then we'll see recreation again, those kind of patterns. Or the other way to see it would be the chaos of the formless and darkness of the deep in Genesis 1 is set in order. But then there's a return to chaos with the flood, and then there's order again. So this is just the pattern again. So, and one thing I thought was really interesting too is the rain. The word for, in verse 12, the rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The word for rain that's used here is the word for heavy winter rain. So Kirsten's laughing because we've had some heavy winter rain in Israel, but which is not like this heavy winter rain by any means. But yeah, it like even just with ideas that if you get into some of the scientific stuff that has been put out around the flood, there's ideas of rain and ice and all of these things. And so it's even using words that coincide with these ideas related to the flood. And so just interesting. But verse 17, the flood came upon the earth for 40 days. The water increased, lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. The water prevailed, or the water triumphed. It's like championing over the earth. It increased greatly upon the earth. The ark floated on the surface of the water. The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. All flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds, cattle, beasts, every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, and all mankind. Of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, that's Genesis 2, about God breathing his breath, his spirit into man. Everything, all of those who had the breath of the spirit of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, so they were blotted out from the earth. And only Noah was left, together with those who were with him in the ark. The water prevailed on the earth 150 days. Like this is, like, if you imagine the narrative like a hurricane, sometimes, how hurricanes, sometimes they'll like stay over an area, and it's just so much more devastating when they just kind of hang out. It's almost like the narrative is moving, and then it just kind of hangs out on the animals and man here at the end. And it's just like the focus of it is just the instruction that's coming from this is the consequence of the wickedness, And I think that, I have to kind of like read these things and remind myself again, like, wow, God killed 99.9% of his creation, of humanity, of the animals. Like, so crazy to think about that, and what that should elicit in us regarding sin and wickedness and the fear of God, in life. We've already had a dress rehearsal in creation for divine judgment on a massive scale. Like, we should learn from that instruction, So, so chaos, right? Decreation. And here is the hinge of the narrative in chapter 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. When did God cause the wind on the waters? It's the same word in Genesis 1. And the Ruach of God was hovering over the waters. This is the same thing. And the Ruach was passed over the earth and the water subsided. It's a picture, again, of recreation. It's a picture of, and obviously it's not a recreation like the earth itself totally went away, but it's the flood waters start to subside. And then we have the narrative just moving forward. We're not going to really cover a ton more here in this chapter, but we have the progression and the time that it takes for the waters to subside, and Noah sending out the birds looking for place and land and all of these things, right? Let's look at verse 20. If you just kind of fast forward a little bit. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. And so Noah's sacrifice is a soothing aroma, which is used in Leviticus for the pleasing sacrifices to the Lord. And so, and God promises, when he smells the soothing aroma, he promises that he will never curse the ground any further. Okay? And the language here is not that he's taking the curse from the earth, that he cursed the ground, right? In Genesis 3, as consequence of man's rebellion, is that you're here to subdue the earth and rule over the earth, and I'm going to make it exceedingly difficult for you by causing the ground to be cursed, and by the sweat of your brow, and in pain you will eat from the ground, and all of this, right? He's not taking that away. He's saying, I'm not adding to that anymore. I won't further that here. He's just making the promise again, even in light of seeing that man's heart has an inclination and a bent towards evil. He is even merciful in this and saying that I'm not going to add on to the curse of the ground. And then I'll never again destroy every living thing as I've done, on account of the continued inclination. And then in 22, it seems like it's referencing the ongoing cycles of creation, that creation itself will go on and continue, in the normal seed time, harvest, cold and heat, summer, winter, day and night. This will go on perpetually. Okay, so chapter 9, God's blessing and covenant. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they're given. Every moving thing that's alive shall be food for you. I give all to you as I gave the green plant. So now meat's on the menu. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Surely I'll require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. And from every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. As for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. So 3 times God blesses humanity. He blesses them in chapter 1, right after the creation of man. He blesses them again in chapter 5, and he blesses them here, coming out of the ark and the judgment event. 3 times he tells them to be fruitful and multiply. Again, in 1, in 8, and then also here in 9. And we just read in verse 5, if you look at the repetition of I'll require it. This is referencing the requirement for recourse for murder and bloodshed. And so the Lord, and we don't have time to get into all the passages. I put a couple here, I believe. Psalm 9, Ezekiel 33 is talking about God requires the life of man, that there's going to be recourse for murder. And it's interesting that it even says here, from every man's brother, I'll require the life of man. The last time the word brother was used was Genesis 4 with Cain. Am I my brother's keeper? Like this is, he's referencing back to the event that took place, and now there's capital punishment going on. And this even carries forward into animals that take human life are killed. Even in the Torah, in Exodus, an ox that gores the man, they put the animal down. Like, this is it's because man is in God's image. There's such value on human life that the recourse for murder is commensurate with that value. It's so intense, you know. All right. So let's look at the covenant. Then God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you, with your descendants after you, with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. I'll establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, This is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. I'll set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of covenant between me and the earth. It shall come about when I bring the cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud. I'll remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, then I'll look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that's on the earth. And God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant which I've established between me and all flesh that's on the earth. So, there's within this section, the partners of the covenant are spoken of in 5 different ways. And what's really strange is, not strange, but just it's pretty amazing, is that most covenants in the Bible are between 2 parties, or they're between God and the nation, the corporate idea. But the Noahic covenant includes the animals in the covenant. They're actually covenant partners with God, which is crazy, because they have no moral innateness to uphold or whatever with the covenant. And so the fact that animals are included. So if you look at, I have on the notes here kind of the cheat sheet for you of, these are the partners, you, Noah, and obviously God is kind of from like God's perspective, but you, Noah, and every living being with you, the earth itself, you and every living being among all flesh, every living being among all flesh which is on the earth, all flesh which is on the earth. That pretty much covers it all, right? Like all man and animals, Noah, his sons, which would be all humanity that comes from them, animals and the earth, are covenant partners. And God says that all flesh shall never again be cut off by water of the flood, nor there will be a flood to destroy the earth. And he says that I will put a sign. This is the sign of the covenant. Now, a lot of covenants, in the covenant formulations, there's signs within the covenant. So the sign of the Abrahamic covenant is circumcision, right? The sign of different covenants have like a particular element to them, and the Noahic covenant is the bow in the clouds. Now, what's interesting about the bow in the clouds, a lot of people will point out is that the word for bow is the word, it's used both for bow, like the weapon of war, and bow, like what we talk about with the rainbow kind of thing. And so in ancient Near Eastern cultures, in these different narratives that existed in their day, like, Babylonian narratives and ancient documents from like Sumer and stuff like that, there are these traditions about the gods being like warriors, wielding bows and like killing people and stuff like this, okay? And even in the Hebrew Scriptures, I'm not saying it's in the same context, but in the Hebrew Scriptures, Yahweh is you'll see things like, he's shooting his arrows, things like in Habakkuk 3, when it's talking about he has a quiver full of arrows and he spins it on his enemies. The Song of Moses talk about him bending his bow and exhausting his arrows on his enemies. And so there's this language of the warfare idea. And so ancient Near Eastern narratives kind of include that in it. And the idea in the Hebrew Scriptures, it kind of is a different idea of him hanging his bow in the cloud, like putting it up. An instrument of war becomes an instrument of peace, And I'm not saying that we should see whatever. There's no reference to bows and arrows in the flood story, obviously. But it's interesting that these other narratives of the day that were in the same context of Genesis have these ideas in them, and that God takes that instrument of war and puts it in the clouds as the sign of peace between him and creation, And so it reminds him of his promises, more so than it reminds us of his promises. We always think the rainbow reminds us of God's promises. Well, in the context here, it actually says that the bow is there for him to see. So look at this. He says, in verse 14, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow will be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant. When God remembers his covenant, he acts within the boundaries of this covenant. I'll remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. Never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all fleshes on the earth. Okay. We're doing good on time. So let's look at this next section. This is going to take us a little bit longer to get through because it's a little bit more problematic. So the sons of Noah and the curse Canaan. So let's just read this little section here, and then we'll get into the issues here. Now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. Then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant, and may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." Noah lived 350 years after the flood, so all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Okay, so here's some main questions to ask when we look at this section. What was the nature of Ham's offense? So much so, and what's really weird in this section is that why is Ham's son, Canaan, cursed for the actions done by his dad, Ham? Why is Grandpa so angsty with me? You know, like growing up as, like, why does Grandpa hate me? You know, what's going on? Doesn't make sense, right? So we need to consider some of these, what's happening in the narrative here. And so there's four main interpretations that we're going to look at. And I'm going to advocate towards one that's less familiar. And just to consider, I'm not trying to push a certain one, but we're going to look at some of these things. So the first one is voyeurism, which is basically, this is the most common one. This is probably the one you've maybe heard, a variation of this idea, is the idea of gaining pleasure by watching others engaged either in sexual activity or seeing others distressed or something like this. And so he's like seeing his silly dad who's drunk and naked, and it's an issue of honor versus dishonor, right? And that kind of becomes the teaching idea in the story. It kind of becomes the moral lesson that we get away from this story of, you know, the honor of family or parents and things like this. The thing that's difficult with this view is it doesn't account for any of the ideas of why Canaan is cursed. It has no answers for that. And also, just in the idea of the ancient time, this view, it assumes the existence that it's taboo to see a naked parent. You know, it's like, you know, back in Genesis, there was no men's locker room stuff going on, right? And that was off limits, right? And so this is the issue with Ham is that idea, all right? Another view is castration, that Ham castrated his father. This is actually very prevalent within rabbinic Jewish literature, okay? And there's all these traditions around it. So I listed those. If you ever want to get into the deep sea of the Talmud, it's interesting. Be my guest, but I don't think that from the text we can really get anything in this area of interpretation. The other view is paternal incest, which a homosexual act took place between Ham and his father. Okay? And then the fourth view is maternal incest, where there was a heterosexual act that took place between Ham and his mother. So, verse 18, so we have, now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. Okay, why does he it's like blurt out this vital information of, you guys need to know that Ham was the father of Canaan, right? Why didn't he say Ham was the father of Lud? Or is it Lud? I think so. In chapter 10. Ham is the father of Cush. Ham is the father of Mitzrayim. Why Canaan here? What's going on? Because Ham had other sons, right? So, again, and this is referenced again explicitly in verse 22. Ham, the father of Canaan, did this. All right? So let's look at verse 20. We're just kind of rereading this section little by little. So Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. And what's interesting here is in the Hebrew it actually says Noah, the man of the ground, planted a vineyard. And so it's kind of ironic because Noah, the expectation was Noah would be the guy that gave us rest from the toil of the soil, of working the soil. And now Noah is working the ground, post-flood. He is the man of the ground. All right? And so it could be referencing back to that chapter 5, verse 29. But he plants the vineyard. He drank of the wine, became drunk, and uncovered himself inside his tent. Okay? So wine and drunkenness is often associated with sexuality in biblical literature throughout the Song of Solomon. It's a major motif through there. Also in Samuel and some of the historical books. And so the only other reference to drunkenness in Genesis is the incest of Lot and his daughters in chapter 19, where we talk about they get their father drunk because they say there's no other men that we can have offspring with, so we're going to make our father drink wine, and we're going to have offspring through him. Okay, we're going to look more at that narrative in a little bit, but that is the only other reference to the wine and drunkenness in the book of Genesis. In verse 21, he uncovers himself inside his tent. And so this word for uncovering is used throughout the Torah, particularly in sexual contexts. And so perhaps what's going on here is that he is preparing for intimacy with his wife in light of the injunction of be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. It's like this is the only family here. And God commands them 2 times in chapter 9, be fruitful and multiply, okay? So again, just the context is this kind of intimate context of what's going on. So, in verse 22, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. This saw the nakedness of his father. To see nakedness or to uncover nakedness is a Hebrew euphemism for heterosexual intercourse. So it is an idiom and a euphemism to refer to sexual intercourse. But it's never used in terms of homosexual practices in the Torah. It's always used in the context of heterosexual, man and woman. Okay? So, if you look at particularly Leviticus 18, if you look at verse 18 here, I have it in the notes. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, that is, the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You are not to uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. Okay? So the nakedness of the father is a euphemism for intercourse with his wife. Okay? Do you guys follow me? This is what's going on in Leviticus 18 all throughout. It's dealing with incestuous relationships that Israel is forbidden to partake in. Okay? And so understanding the idiom, it's like, okay, like nakedness of the father is not the father, it's the mother. Okay? But this is the idiom that's used throughout, not only Leviticus 18, but it's also used here, and also I put some other verses here in verse chapter 20 and other references in 20. I didn't really list all of them out there for you guys, but so then he tells his brothers. So in verse 22, he told his brothers, and then it references later, Noah awoke and knew what his youngest son had done to him. And so in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, this was a threat to patriarchal authority, and a means of usurping a father or leader's position was sleeping with his wife, or in the ancient Near Eastern kings, it was sleeping with members of the harem or stuff like that. You guys know what I'm talking about when I say these things, okay? And I listed passages throughout the scriptures where there's references where like people are trying to usurp authority by doing this. Okay? It happens within King David and other people during the historical time, the historical kingdom of Judah and stuff like this. And so this is probably not a pure motivation of lust, but a family power play of who is the alpha male kind of idea of what's happening. So, and that would also explain why he goes out to tell his brothers about it, of gaining some kind of thing with what's going on. So, so verse 23, Shem and Japheth took a garment, or literally it's took the garment, and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. And so these actions, they coincide with both to see the nakedness. If it is an idiom or a euphemism, then obviously his brothers did not have any type of sexual intercourse, right? If that's the idiom. But also it says they did not look even. So it could carry also the idea of they walked backwards to not even look and gaze on their father's nakedness, which which could be even the idea of them walking back and covering their mother, which would also kind of explain why they would walk backwards and not even look at what's going on and just cover. Okay? And so a lot of commentators, I will point out this just because I'm trying to give you guys some views and some arguments for what's going on too, but a lot of commentators will point out that, see, look, this has to just be him seeing, because it can't be an idiom, because his brothers don't look on her nakedness, and it seems like it's just only a literal thing. Do you guys follow what I'm saying? But a lot of times with idioms or euphemisms, so it's funny because Kirsten and I, this is what she gets for being married to like a nerd, Bible nerd, but I'm like, honey, let's talk about modern day euphemisms, because I'm trying to make a connection of like how do we, so we're driving in the car today talking about it. What was the one we came up with? Put to sleep. Yeah. So put to sleep is a euphemism for death, for most of the time for animals, right? We don't say, and I injected the dog with poison to kill them. Like, we say, put the animal to sleep. But it's not just a disconnected phrase that has nothing to do with the actual literal thing that goes on. It still has a connect point to it, right? Because the animal literally just sleeps forever, basically. Yeah. So it's like the same thing. So this is actually, I think this is why it can be argued in verse 23 that them not looking on the nakedness of their father kind of carries the idiom definition and the literal definition kind of built up into one idea of they're going to cover. Okay? So, verse 25, Noah curses Canaan, Ham's son, to be the slave of slaves, or the servant of servants. Okay? So while the three interpretations, a lot of them, they give no explanation to why Ham himself is not cursed and why Canaan is. The maternal incest view gives an explanation here, which is the strength of the view I'm just giving for you guys to consider, is that Noah curses the product of this illicit union between Ham and his mom. Because no other view explains why Ham is cursed very adequately, and why there is so much need to say Ham is the father of Canaan. Ham is the father of Canaan, right? And so this is why there's multiple references, and this is probably, an argument could be, this is showing how Ham became the father of Canaan. Possibly. All right? So Canaan, if you look at the lineage as it goes forward into history, Canaan becomes the most antagonistic historical enemies of Israel. And they're polemicized against in the Torah all throughout, especially, there's especially a connection with this Leviticus 18 that we talk about as defining what these terms mean about the father's nakedness and stuff like this. It opens up with, don't be like the Canaanites in their practices, and don't be like the Egyptians in their practices who do all of these incestuous things. And so it kind of goes right down the lineage of this is what's going on. And then Leviticus 18 is saying, children of Israel, don't be like the Canaanites. And actually, we know that the Canaanites are those that are totally devoted to destruction. When Israel goes into the land, God says, I want you to wipe them out completely. Don't leave any of them. And they become the primary, because that doesn't happen, they actually become the primary enemies that entice Israel to follow after their gods. And Israel goes after the gods of the land and worships all of these other Elohim in the land. And Yahweh says, this is not right. This is within the covenant. I'm going to judge Israel. Like, it's just a continued pattern throughout the narrative. Okay, within Genesis, what's interesting is within Genesis, right after the two events of divine judgment, which often they come on the heels of sexual sin and in other sins, Genesis 6 through 8, the flood, and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. These are two major judgment events. Right after these two events, there are these seemingly incestuous, illicit transgression of boundary relationships that happen. Right? Flood, Ham. And Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's daughters. These two produce Israel's main adversaries, the Canaanites, and Lot's daughters become the Moabites and the Ammonites, who throughout Israel's history are major enemies of Israel, and even through to the eschatology of what's going to come in the future, the day of the Lord, like these Moab and Edom and all of these areas are, and Ammon, the sons of Ammon, are fiercely judged by the Lord in the day of the Lord events. So if you look at the chart here, I just put a sequence of transgressed boundaries. We kind of talked about that last time of there's the human divine to be like the gods, and then there's the consequences like the cursed ground, death, and all of these things. Then Genesis 6, divine human, right? Lifespan is limited, the judgment of the flood. Then in Genesis 9, what we have is we have human and human transgressed boundaries, right? If we go with this interpretation, it's human and human transgressed boundaries, and there's a cursed lineage, the line of Canaan. And then human and divine, again, we looked at last week, Genesis 10 through 11, and there's scattering that happens. So, verse 26. He also said, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem." And so, what's interesting is you would kind of think that it would be, "Blessed be Shem," right? But the blessing is actually more of like a doxology. It's more of a, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem." And so, it's identifying Shem as the one who, through the election and the blessing, will flow because of the association with Yahweh, his God. And so, blessed be the God of Shem, kind of like the God of Abraham, right? Blessed be the God of Abraham. It's because the covenant is bound up between Abraham and God. So, then he says, may God enlarge Japheth, which it's a play on words. It's because the may he enlarge is Yaft, and then Japheth is Leyaphet. So Yaft, Leyaphet. It's kind of his play on of his name, and his name actually means like to be opened or to be enlarged. And so, so it's just kind of playing on his name. And it says, "Let him dwell in the tents of Shem." So the question is, let him dwell. Who's the him that dwells in the tents of Shem? Is it God or is it Japheth? Right? And so Jewish tradition has, and like early writings from between the Old Testament and the New Testament, Jewish works during that time, say that it's actually God. It's a reference to God dwelling in the tents of Shem, kind of referring to the idea of God's dwelling among Israel, or that idea. But the problem with it is it doesn't really seem like the subject switches here. it seems like, make God enlarge Japheth, who's the subject, let Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem. And then it says, let Canaan be their servant. It's in the plural, not his servant, like the only one, but let him be their servant. And so it seems like likely it's referring to Japheth. But this is a kind of a textual debate that people have with stuff. But what that would mean is that if it is Japheth, then the idea is that Japheth finds dwelling and really finds blessing within the boundaries of the tents of Shem, which are the Shemites, which are the Semites, which are the nation of Israel who comes from that lineage. And Japheth really spreads out, and we'll get into this maybe next week with the Table of Nations, but Japheth kind of becomes like part of the Gentile lineage, those that go into, whatever, up north and all about their Greek and all of that idea. So it could be a reference to the idea of the covenant that the nations find blessing in aligning with Shem, the covenant through Shem.